Good afternoon. Welcome to Friendly Neighborhood Libertarian. Today's guest is Kevin R. Gutzman, the New York Times best-selling author of 5 books. Today, we're going to be discussing his book, Who Killed the Constitution? And I have been I've been looking forward to this for quite some time, as I think it's really good to hear a dissenting opinion on whether the Constitution's a good thing at all. And what a better place to do that than in my home state of Connecticut. Welcome, Kevin. How are you doing today?
Good to be here.
Great. So I guess my first question for you is, I went through the Mises Institute's website, and I'm kind of curious, what got you from attorney to academic?
Well, my first idea was to become a politician.
Hmm.
So I was an undergraduate at the University of Texas at Austin, and I decided, well, I'll get a law degree at UT, which at the time was in the top 10 among law schools and was the
Hmm.
cheapest law school in America, besides being in Austin. So I didn't even apply anywhere else. Why would I go anywhere else? And while I was thinking about doing that, I had a friend talk to me about the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And I thought, well, I'm going to go into politics. That sounds like a good idea. So I applied there. They gave me what's called the Johnson Family Fellowship, which meant essentially my degree was free. And it was a 2-year program and involved a summer internship in some kind of public policy institute. And so I worked on Capitol Hill in Washington one summer. It happened that was the summer of the bicentennial of the Constitution. And so all the museums, all the bookstores were full of things to do with the Constitution. And I became very interested in that, thinking that this would prepare me for law school. But it turned out in law school that common law didn't really have much to do with the Constitution. So
Hmm.
I was actually turned off to law by law school. And it just kind of followed naturally that the few things that interested me in law school and at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, I could work on constantly if I had a history PhD and became a professor. So that's how I ended up where I am. I ended up writing about essentially the Revolution, American Revolution, and founding era, and constitutional history. So it really springs from the fact that I didn't like law school, and yet there were some few classes that I found interesting. When I was a lawyer, which I was for a while, I would go in the morning and I would count minutes till lunch when I could go to a local restaurant and read a book for an hour.
Hmm.
After a while, I thought, well, am I going to wish my life away for the next 45, 50 years? It didn't make sense. So I went and got a PhD, and I have not regretted it. Actually, the first time we had a meeting of my intern cohort of American history grad students at UVA, the two professors who were running this event, had us go around the room to each explain why he was there. And I said, my name's Kevin Gutzman. As of this minute, I'm a former attorney. And everybody applauded. So I have not regretted it. Oh, it would be nice to be making a lot more money. But other than that, I have not regretted it.
Yeah, no, that's really inspiring. I guess something that I'm also curious is how do you end up in Connecticut?
That's just
And
how the academic job market works. Essentially, you get a PhD in history, for example. What you do is generally you interview for professor jobs at the American Historical Association convention, and I did. I got several interviews at the convention, and then I ended up being hired at John Jay College in Manhattan. And at the time, we wanted to homeschool our kids, and it turned out New York was a terrible state in which to try to homeschool your kids. So was New Jersey. So I was working in Manhattan and commuting from Connecticut, which had a kind of hands-off approach at that time. I think more about Insky now than they were then. This was 1999 when I started doing that. And so here I was in Connecticut commuting a very long way into Manhattan for work, and a nearby college advertised a job in my field, and I applied and I got it. Here I am. Didn't move. It's very unusual, actually, for a history professor changing jobs, but The short of it is I would never have planned to live here. My dad was in the Army when I was a kid. I lived in Panama, Hawaii. Actually, I lived in 12 states, DC, and one foreign country by the time I got my PhD. And uh, if you said to me, well, what part of the country would you least want to live in? I would have said, well, obviously the cold, empty states in the north central part of the country. But after that, New England. So here I am spending my life in New England, which I did not want. If I had an alternative, I would take it. But it's not the way the academic job market works. You don't get to pick in general where you live. So,
Hmm. That's interesting. So I guess maybe another question that immediately comes up is I've been hearing a lot about like a lack of viewpoint diversity in academia in general.
yes.
Um, could you tell me a little bit about how you feel like your department runs? Because I've heard some varying stories depending on where you are at school.
How I feel about the way my department runs. Well, there is pretty much a stultifying uniformity of opinion, and there is an expectation that one will assimilate, and
Hmm.
not doing so has various negative potential consequences. I have encountered some of them in my own career, and so have other people I know who are not kind of in the academic mainstream, which has
Hmm.
changed considerably since I entered academia. That sequence of events I was talking about before, those my entering grad school in history was in 1992. So from 1992 to 2024, there's been a considerable further shift of academia away from my own political, economic, constitutional views.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say about that. I think,
Hmm.
obviously, if I had a publication record half the length of mine, but I were writing in trendy subjects, I would be at some prestigious university at the moment. But I knew that when I went into it. So
Hmm.
I've been able to write whatever I wanted. I've essentially been happy with the publicity my books have gotten and sales figures and such. So,
Hmm.
as far as the typical person with a history PhD goes, I can't complain. I got a career I'm happy with. I wouldn't say I'm satisfied with, but I'm happy with. So it's totally
Hmm.
unlike being a lawyer, where again, you make a lot of money and count minutes till lunch. Really, so that was just a dreary prospect of life. I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've been thinking about that a lot in my own personal life, where I have sort of taken the money path as opposed to the passion path.
Yeah.
Um, and like, I feel like that comes with the necessary trade-offs. I
Well, it's
guess
not
what I'm
obvious.
sorry.
Yeah. You just have to decide, do you want to get your satisfaction during your work hours or during your off hours?
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So I guess I'm really curious. So when I was going through and reading your book, something that I was unable to tell was whether you thought the Constitution was like an effective political document to begin with, because while you've definitely come to the conclusion that the Constitution is dead and that there's no reviving it, um, that still doesn't really tell us a lot about like what you think about the Constitution. I wanted to sort of probe a little further into that.
well, I've written 6 books and hundreds of other things, and they're all generally about this topic, more or less. And I don't know a better alternative. Somebody
Hmm.
asked Ron Paul a couple of years back whether he was an anarchist, and he said, "Well, I've never been able to figure out how you could have a private police force." And I thought, well, this is unsurprising. He was in Congress for 25 years. What do you think he's going to say? But that's kind of where I am. I can't really imagine a scenario in which you want to have
Hmm.
anarchy, actual anarchy.
Yeah.
So there you go. You have to make do with what you have. And the idea of constitutional government is better than not. And
Yeah.
most of the time, when you're arguing on behalf of respecting the Constitution, it leads to superior outcomes to the ones we get by ignoring it most of the time. So I guess it's kind of least bad option.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Yeah,
So,
it has come to be the case that a large share of the voting population is perfectly happy to see it just ignored.
mhm,
Today, of course, in the news all the time are major ways that people in prominent positions in the government just ignore it. For example, it's obviously the Biden administration's position that the immigration laws will just be completely ignored. Doesn't matter how many millions of unvetted foreigners enter the country, they'll just be just just pretend that that's perfectly fine, and
mhm,
and they go on blathering about Trump being lawless. Well, maybe he is, but what about you people? So you're the ones in power. So
mhm,
uh, yeah, that's kind of where you end up most of the time. Although sometimes making that kind of an argument can lead to good outcomes,
mhm.
or can lead to worse outcomes. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, no, thinking about that, I guess the immediate thing I've been thinking about was you were writing a lot about how judicial restraint seems more as a way to punish one's enemies than, at least in principle, to restrain the government, and that it's more about like intra-government conflict as opposed to um, protecting the people's rights. Is that a side effect though? Like, has the Supreme Court in any meaningful sense protected people's rights, or has it like seemed to be one of the more activist parts of the government? I guess it seems to me like a lot of the problems that the Supreme Court has pretty aggressively increased the power of the presidency.
Well, I don't think I've ever been an advocate of judicial restraint per se. There's some areas in which the court has been hyperactive, and I've opposed that when they were contrary to the Constitution. But I mentioned before my educational background. I got my JD in 1990, and when I was in law school, it still was the case that the leading intellectual light of the previous 50 years on the Supreme Court in American law was a justice named William Brennan, whose attitude about being a justice was essentially, as he famously explained to his clerks, I operate by the rule of five. With five votes, I can do anything. And so restraint in overturning precedents established by Justice Brennan, certainly I did not and do not favor. There's still controversy about there being overruled now, even though I think he died in 1989 or something like that. So
Hmm.
um, you may have heard recently that the
Yeah.
Chevron deference
Hmm.
doctrine was uh, overturned, and this is another legacy of Brennan. So, but again, I don't think judicial deference makes sense. The Constitution has clear meaning.
Hmm.
We're supposed to enforce it. So, I don't think I've ever advocated judicial deference. But what I don't like is imperialist behavior by the judiciary. The judges just making
Hmm.
law because they're able to get away with it. They often can force policy outcomes they prefer just by saying the Constitution requires it, and often it doesn't.
Hmm.
That's the main thing I've been against. So I've written quite a lot about that. Actually, there's some of that in the Code Constitution, and also my previous book about constitutional history and politically incorrect guide to the Constitution shows that that started almost as soon as the Constitution was implemented and has been a problem. But it was more commonly posed earlier. Nowadays, it
Hmm.
seems that a large share of the population, and I think most intellectuals, favor judicial legislation, judicial imperialism, judicial
Hmm.
uh, fatuous fatuous arguments for striking down whatever laws they don't like, which is just lawless. It's not constitutional government. Now you probably are thinking, well, that's what you expect. Yeah, that's what you expect.
Yeah.
My last book is called The Jeffersonians, and at one point in that book, I show that Jefferson, when he was president at the very beginning of the 19th century, complained that judges tended to behave this way, and he said the main flaw of the Constitution was that there's no way to do anything about it. So you have to
Mhm.
wait for somebody to die, and then you have to hope whoever the president is at the time will be inclined to appoint a new justice who's got a different attitude, which, as I was saying before, most of virtually all of one of our two major parties and much of the other one favor this kind of behavior. So you can't
Yeah.
you can't have constitutional government unless voters want it, I think is what it comes down to. And an
Hmm.
alternative to it is just arbitrary lawmaking by the justice, letting the executive get away with doing whatever it wants, or usually forcing state governments to implement new policies that nobody ever voted for. That's my main complaint about it.
Do you think that the toothpaste is sort of like out of the bottle, or is there any way that governance can get better? Like I'm thinking, does something like private governance play a role in some semblance of like dignity amongst knowing how to proceed, or are we just, going to be stuck in kind of a dysfunctional government for the foreseeable
Uh,
future?
as I was saying before, I don't. I agree with Ron Paul. I can't see how you can have a private police force. So
Hmm.
that's the problem. In theory, you'd rather have. Well, in theory, it's the case, and always will be the case, that people in the government will abuse their powers when they get away with it. But what's the alternative to having a government police force? What's the alternative to having a government army? Um, so
Hmm.
there's
So
some
if I,
some think that public, however you want to embody it, is going to have
yeah,
reform by some elected, preferably elected, and sometimes career people who are supposed to be overseen by people who are elected. Um, People like that are going to be making these kinds of policies. In other words, how are you going to have a private FAA? You need an FAA
hmm
about that if you don't have a government.
yeah, this kind of like has me thinking a little bit more about the activist view of the presidency. I know you were mentioning Roosevelt a lot in the sense of I'm the president, I'm the unitary executive. Like,
That actually traces back to Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson, my bad. Would
He
you
was,
say that like that's sort of accurate
he
though?
was
Like
the
in
first
the sense,
scientist who wrote about this. Actually, he criticized the American Constitution for being unlike the British one. In Britain, the chief executive, more or less, is also the head of the majority in the legislature. It's as if the
mhm,
Speaker of the House were Commander in Chief of the military. And uh, Wilson thought, well, that just makes sense. Why isn't our system that way? So he thought that having tripartite government and so-called checks and balances, this is just old-fashioned. It's going to get in the way of government doing things. But of course, that assumes that you want government always to be doing whatever the latest majority favors at the moment, which probably you don't. I certainly don't. So um, I don't agree with Wilson. I don't think the British model is better.
mhm.
But the bottom line is, I think you were getting at, as long as you have people in these positions, they're going to abuse their power when they get away with it. And you see that happening right now. You know, the outstanding example is as soon as the Biden administration came into office, they immediately just ceased enforcing the border on the Mexican border. So um, I've seen anywhere from 13 to 15 million people have entered the country illegally. And this week, we heard that 15,000 of them were convicted were convicted had been convicted of homicide in their home countries, and 13,000 had been convicted of sexual assault. Well, uh, you can kind of guess why the people who are allowing this are allowing it. They think it's going to benefit them. They think probably that people of these descriptions are going to end up voting for the party that's currently in control of the executive branch. But that doesn't mean it's a good thing. In
Mhm.
general, you're not partisan of the current party currently running the executive branch. Even if you were, I think people a lot of them would say, yeah, no, I don't really think I want 15,000 unvetted people who've been convicted of sexual assault in their own countries immigrating into the United States, going who knows
Yeah.
what. Yeah, it's crazy, I think.
Yeah. No, I guess I'm trying to imagine that in the realm of you wrote something that I thought was like really interesting about the philosophy of the union being marriage as opposed to a merger. If
Yeah.
we took that philosophy seriously, like what sort of outcomes do you think that would entail? And would that even be possible to move towards a more compact view of federalism?
Well, what we say in the book is that that's the way people understood it in the first place, and there's abundant evidence.
Mhm.
I actually keep referencing my own books, which is kind of obnoxious, I know, but um, in my book about James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, wrote one about each of them, I show that each of them had this idea. Essentially, that's the way they understood the Constitution. It had been about creating marriage, not an amalgamation. And um, what that gets back to is that the system is supposed to have delegated only a few powers to the central government, leaving most to the states. The problem is nowadays people are taught, I guess, in both primary and secondary schools, and I know at college level in most colleges, that, well, we've gotten good outcomes over time by having the federal government make rules. Then sometimes people would object that these kinds of questions were supposed to have been left for state determination. And we're told that's a troglodyte kind of answer to pressing need to have whatever the latest popular reform idea might be implemented. So uh, it certainly is preferable. And actually, there is a majority. One reason we've heard a lot of noise in the last couple of years about the Supreme Court is for the first time since 1937, we have a majority on the Supreme Court that more or less has that view.
Mhm.
So who knows how long that'll last, but it's the case now. And I think I'm an Army brat. As I said before, I've lived in 12 states in one foreign country besides DC, however you want to classify that. And I can tell you that people in different states in the United States want markedly different government. People in California, where I lived for a while, want markedly different government from people in Louisiana, where I lived for a while. And I
Mhm.
think the actual structure of government people who made the federal system had in mind, they California and Louisiana could have markedly different governments. But as it is now, we've had a long period in which we had just gratuitous enforcement of uniformity by federal courts and to some extent by the other by the elected branches of the federal government. So I think that what this leads to is people are just less happy. They, you know, where I live now, I live in Connecticut.
Mhm.
Here would like to have a government kind of like Sweden's. And people in Louisiana would like to have a government. I don't know. Um, well, they they have an idea of different kind of public morality in Louisiana, what people want in New England.
Mhm.
And the beauty of the original American federal system was they could have that. If you in Louisiana, when I was a kid and lived in Louisiana for a while, my dad was in the army. That's why I moved around so much. Every Friday in public school, we had fish for lunch. Why was that? Well, it was because the apparently the Catholic Archbishop of New Orleans was the last Catholic prelate in the country to get rid of the requirement that Catholics have fish on Friday. So
Mhm.
they did that in Louisiana public schools. And on the other hand, in California, of course, they were never going to do anything like that. My point is, the way the system was set up, the highly conservative people in Louisiana could have a government they wanted. And how's it going to hurt Californians if they do? It's not at all. But we have this idea, again, in our culture now that somewhere, somehow, somebody in a place I've never been and will never go might be doing something I don't like. So we'd have a
Mhm.
national rule about that.
Yeah, that actually brings up a question that I was thinking about. When you talked about freedom of religion as a right protected from the national as opposed to the state governments, Do
Yeah.
you think that there's any role in the federal government protecting people's rights? Like the example that I think comes to mind is like economic due process in the,
Well, due process against state governments is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. So that's an expressly provided federal right. Um, of course, there are a far more numerous group of kinds of policy over which the federal government is not supposed to have any say when it comes to what the states are doing. And
Mhm.
I think this is was getting at before. Having lived in every region of the United States, including Hawaii, um, people I know that people in different parts of the country just want different kinds of government. But there is this kind of impulse among intellectuals to think, okay, I have a good idea, and that means it's the best idea, and it should just be enforced everywhere. And so we have this uh, kind of pretense that the Constitution requires. The scholars who argue for this always end up finding that the Constitution requires their own personal preferences being enforced throughout the country, right? So I can name prominent libertarian scholars who do this, as well as
Mhm.
prominent left-wing scholars who do this. So whenever you hear somebody saying the Constitution requires that my policy preferences be enforced all over the country, your BS detector should go off immediately, even if you don't know
Yeah.
what the argument is about. That's a technical legal term, by the way. So anyway, uh, I am actually more interested in this idea than I am in policies they're arguing about.
Hmm.
I don't
Something.
know that much what kids have for lunch in public school in Louisiana, but the idea that a justice from California gets to make up a rule about that for Louisiana, it just kind of drives me nuts. And as you were saying, I think I've shown for anybody who cares, that's not the way the system is supposed to work.
Hmm. Then my
Well,
last
it
question.
does not work that way, but it's not supposed to work that
Mhm.
way.
So kind of moving in a slightly different direction. I know when you gave the example of the steel seizure,
Yeah.
about like imminent lawlessness that executives can pretty much cultivate whenever. And like obviously this is a bad thing. Something I was a little confused about is why do you think executives don't do that more, given that they generally want power?
Well, I think they do it quite a lot. We've seen growing amount of this kind of behavior in the last half century. So the current, I think, of course, there's always a tendency to say, well, the current administration is the one. No, but actually, we have this just amazing um, non nonfeasance of enforcement of federal immigration laws going on right now and involving millions and millions of people.
Mhm.
So that's pretty flagrant. And
Yeah.
uh, it's not, there's no claim that it's legal, but there's nobody who's in a position to do anything about it. There's only the executive can enforce the immigration laws. Nobody in Congress can do that. No, governors can't do that. You've seen Abbott of Texas, for example, has tried to do something about huge ingress of people into his state, but he's essentially unable to prevent it. So uh, presidents know this in general. There's a lot of slack. Whatever they can get away with politically, they can get away with. Actually, when I was a kid, we had the Watergate controversy, and after Richard Nixon resigned the presidency, he gave a televised interview to a British journalist, and finally the fellow asked him whether he didn't think he'd broken the law, and Nixon said, "If the president does it, it's not illegal."
Hmm.
He literally said that. But
That's
the thing
crazy.
is,
Yeah.
to some extent, in a lot of areas of law enforcement, it's true that if the president, as chief executive, allows particular acts to be taken, he allows particular behavior, then there's nobody else who can do anything about it. That's the point. So Nixon, of course, was a very smart lawyer. I think he was number one in his class at Duke Law School, which is the best law school. He was when he went. So, of course, it's not supposed to work this way, but he realized perfectly well there's a lot of play in the system. He had grown up, uh, he had been a youth and a young man during the presidencies of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, so he'd seen that this was true.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for talking with me today. I know that my time is about to run out, so I just wanted to give you a quick thank you.